I now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Lady. Mr. Roman, are you aware that we are sending $40 million a week to the Taliban?
Yes, sir.
Can you name other instances of foreign aid going to terrorist organizations?
We have assisted al-Shabaab in Somalia. There's been instances of the Khamsi network in Sudan, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Kataib al-Hezbollah, Hayat Tahrir al-Shams in Syria. Dozens of terror organizations have received indirect assistance from U.S. foreign aid.
Could you elaborate a little bit on the mechanisms in place that are to stop foreign aid from going to terrorist groups, and why are they not working if we have any in place?
Sure.
And I would note that these are, you notice these are terrorist weaponry. You see some AKs, SKSs, some snipers, some clips, some clip carriers probably made in China, and I believe these are small landmines here beside right there.
Let's use Gaza as our case study. $2.1 billion in American taxpayers' money to Gaza since October 7th when Hamas invaded southern Israel. USAID money was going in terms of an emergency use authorization to try to go to parties that USAID formerly had a relationship with in the Gaza Strip. They had to have been vetted by OFAC. They should have been vetted against the special designated terror list from the State Department and from other Treasury organizations. Waivers were granted because they said that there was an emergency use to have that money come in to Gaza, thereby jettisoning the usual typical screening procedures. As a result, 90% of aid that was going from the United States by way of its agents in Gaza ended up in Hamas-controlled areas. And this is ridiculous. Essentially, what the U.S. assistance to Gaza did was underwrite the ability for Hamas to survive until the ceasefire was just passed a few weeks ago. There was no strategic thought for it, and there was no screening.
Seems like the emergency might have been armed terrorists to kill civilians. Would that be accurate?
That's accurate, and even more than that, Samantha Powers, the administrator for USAID, was intent on having Israel not be able to defend itself.
To not be able to defend it.
Correct.
Mr. Primorak, is that correct? How do you say that? Primorak? I got Burchett, man. Nobody gets mine right, so don't worry about it. What is it, Primorak?
Perfect.
All right, thanks, brother. How did terrorists exploit our foreign aid loopholes?
Well, we have a lot of our international.
Can you pull your mic up? I'm sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
You have international NGOs and UN agencies actively lobby here in Washington, D.C. against vetting policies that would prevent it. I was the senior vetting officer at USAID, and what we did.
Did you say United Nations is doing this? The UN?
Sure, everybody who's getting money lobbies here.
That they're lobbying against us. I'm sorry, Mr. Roman.
There's actually someone who used to work for one of those lobbies, the largest NGO lobby, Interaction. One of our co-witnesses here worked for them from 2018 to 2023. USAID effectively self-funds its own external private lobby that then goes back to Congress and asks for more money for USAID.
So the taxpayers fund this lobbyist who's working against American interests.
Correct.
Possibly killing our allies and possibly Americans.
They bring together groups in Washington that overseas work with groups that kill Americans.
Yeah, I don't need a flow chart to show that. I appreciate it. Do you think USAID programs have been aligned with the national security interests of the U.S.?
No, they have not. They have actually helped China.
Mr. Roman?
No.
Okay. How do these programs compromise our national security, Mr. Primorak?
They actually push China. They actually push much of the world towards China on the green energy agenda. They push people, ordinary people, billions of people towards China because of the resentment caused by our social re-engineering.
Are we being lobbied by these pro-communist China groups currently?
Well, a lot of these countries don't even have to lobby because they get the money anyway, like South Africa.
Yeah, and in fact, these lobbyists have come to the House and have tried to kill legislation like H.R. 160, which was meant to increase transparency in USAID's funding of overseas organizations.
Is that a current piece of legislation?
That's from the last session.
And give me that number again.
H.R. 160.
And what does it do?
It was meant to give U.S. lawmakers the ability to have higher transparency in terror financing investigations aimed at scrutinizing extremist groups.
Mr. Primorak?
We had a regulation before we left in the last administration that anybody who touches money in countries where there's terrorists, those names have to go through databases, terrorist databases. That was overturned by Biden.
Overturned by Biden.
Islamist organizations which work with designated terror organizations in different Middle Eastern countries and territories came under attack by our organization, the Middle East Forum, back in 2017. They put together a lobby which acted as an umbrella to go to Congress to say, ignore that organization that's exposing public data about money going to radical organizations. They're so-called, quote-unquote, Islamophobic. So by using politically charged language, they try to cover up their associations with terror organizations. Then they went back to USAID, said, look, Congress is going to fund us now because we lobbied for successful bills, and they got more money.
And what steps would you say, Mr. Roman, are needed to be taken to ensure grant recipients follow the rules and cooperate with the policies in place?
I think there's a gap in vetting and enforcement, allowing funds to move both directly and indirectly to extremist-linked groups. You have to have a pipeline where all the money that's coming out of U.S. government coffers is traceable exactly to which organization and subgrantee it goes to. And then once, if you have $1 touch one individual, that individual or that organization has to report back to be compared against U.S. vetting databases before a check is cut to them.
And if I could ask the same question to you, Mr. Primarak, what are some steps we could take to ensure the grant recipients don't evade some of the requirements needed?
I think we need to have a consolidated website where every single award and sub-award is on there, where not only members of Congress can look at it, but the American people who fund this can go through it. And that's the kind of transparency and accountability that's going to force folks to be careful what they do.
And if I can just ask, we'll go back to Mr. Roman. I really appreciated that example. With what time I have left, could you offer any other examples of mechanisms by which entities evaded transparency requirements, something that we all talk about, and we've all seen the egregious spending across the board that's been illuminated by many members of this committee over the last 2 weeks. But when it comes to evading some of these requirements, I want to speak directly to that and enter that into the record to the extent you could share.
There's a bifurcation of the problem. One is the organizations which are abusing U.S. taxpayer dollars, but the second is the bureaucrats who are allowing them to get away with it. Sometimes because they're not looking and being blind to the issue. Other times because they're intentionally pursuing an ideological agenda that Congress didn't appropriate or authorize. You have to direct funding to have individuals that are getting money to be able to authorize that money, and the reports on the grants that they make after the funding period is over should also be publicly available rather than just how much money was spent. In addition to that, there is many other individuals and partnerships that go beyond USAID. For instance, foundations supporting extremists, persistent lapses in sanctions enforcement, and also potential violations of U.S. criminal statutes. The report that we put out suggests that funding streams may have contravened laws prohibiting material support to terrorism, sanctions violations, fraud, and false statements, both by the grantees and some of the grantors.
And so some of these dollars have been going to support terrorist organizations.
Right. And
taxpayer dollars going to support. Now, what would happen if we found a business that was funneling money to the Taliban?
They would be indicted. They would be charged, go before trial, and go to jail for a 20-year sentence for money laundering or for material support for terrorism.
So this is one of those cases where it's only legal if the government's doing it?
Right. In the opening chairman's remarks, she was saying that this is about fraud, waste, and abuse, and if it was anyone else, it's as if though a private citizen can't do this, but if a U.S. government agency or bureaucrat wants to give money to a terror organization, it's okay.
Yeah, I find that atrocious. I think the American people do too. Mr. Primarak, I want to touch on one thing because I've talked to ambassadors across the world, and you hear this. We'd like to align ourselves with the United States. We don't want to align ourselves with China, but when we're talking to China, they're talking roads, bridges, infrastructure, those kind of things. Things we traditionally know as soft power. But right now when they're talking to the United States, what they've gotten from our State Department over the last few years is social reengineering. Many of them have come to say, our nation espouses Judeo-Christian values. They don't. And even as I talk to pastors across our country who are working to send millions into missionaries, their eyes in Christian universities to understand the fact that our State Department is actually sending billions to counteract those ideals. Could you speak to that?
You can quickly answer, and we have to move on.
I've spoken to many foreign African officials, for example, when they're meeting with Mr. Blinken, they were ready to talk counter-genocide. Instead, they got to social reengineering.
How do we make sure when we get our foreign aid back running that we don't give money to terrorists? That's a great question.
So there's 4 recommendations that I would offer. The first is no more miscellaneous listings, as we had heard from the gentleman before. We have to use public vetting processes that require complete transparency, encourage independent audits, and mandate
Can we go
strict
back
screening.
to that? Why did we not have transparency before?
I have, for the last 18 months, been trying to get information about a grant made to what we believe is a Hamas affiliate, and the Freedom of Information Act Department, or the Freedom of Information Officer at USAID, has stonewalled me for the last year and a half. And this goes back all the way to 2015. It's as if though
Bureaucrats think they know better.
bureaucrats think they know better.
USAID spent tens of millions of American taxpayer dollars to promote propaganda in Brazil in the lead up to the Bolsonaro-Lula election in 2022. It has been claimed that this funding was used to pass censorship laws and silence Bolsonaro's online presence, and even bar him from running for office in the future. Mr. Primorak, can you offer any insight into these allegations, or at least comment on whether the U.S. should play a role in toppling democratic processes around the world?
I think what we saw was USAID weaponized by the Biden administration and by Samantha Power to attack any party that was conservative. It just didn't happen in Brazil. It also happened, for instance, in very pro-America, Poland and Hungary as well.
One of the most extensive examples of regime change operations fueled by USAID is that of their role in the Syrian civil war aimed at toppling Bashar al-Assad. Reports from DD Geopolitics and other sources estimate that USAID funneled over $15 billion into Syria over a decade, covertly funding opposition groups, mercenaries, and anti-government networks under the cover of humanitarian aid. This included support for militant factions and propaganda efforts, often in collaboration with the National Endowment for Democracy. The operation culminated in Assad's overthrow in 2024 by Western-backed groups, with USAID's financial trails documented in congressional budget reports and criticized by Syrian officials as interference masked as assistance. Mr. Roman, do these kinds of activities carried out by an American agency make Americans safer at home, or do they risk embroiling us in more deadly and costly foreign conflicts?
When the agency is doing it according to the way in which represents American national security interests, it's correct. But when it's abused for political purposes, ideological umbrage, and sponsoring Islamism, which is inherently anti-American, it is the worst exhaustion of American taxpayer money that can be thought of, especially when it leads to the loss and danger to American lives.
Mm-hmm.